when do you think people will start realizing how valuable the data, like their daily activities and all the things that are giving away for free, when will people come to realize how valuable that is?
When the next door neighbor is basically in a job that does that or makes money in that area or suddenly generates value from that. We can see this, for instance, in places like the Philippines. I know there's a game that we backed very early on called Axie Infinity that did really well. It's gotten in the headlines of mainstream media often for bad reasons because people talked about the speculation, and we can talk about that a little bit because Web3 is really an underpinning of a capitalist framework. And I think one of the reasons why a lot of people are anti-Web3 is because they're actually anti-capitalism. So I think there is a little bit of that aspect as well, which is also the reason why I think Asia is very pro-Web3, because Asia is generally very pro-capitalism. If you think about the history of Asia, I mean, most of us didn't even have, my parents' generation didn't have property. There was no capital whatsoever. Yeah. The government or whatever sort of dictatorship owned the land or that feudal properties that they had, they would just take it away from you. So we broadly benefited. I mean, we're here in South Korea. 40 years ago, the GDP of South Korea was smaller than North Korea.
Yes.
And look today, it's the 12th or 13th largest sort of GDP in the world.
So capitalism works.
Capitalism works, and in living memory, we remember that. But in the West, people don't, because one, partially they take their democratic infrastructure for granted, and two, capitalism hasn't worked for them in the last 20 years, right? If you look at the qualities of labor versus capital, if you've basically been in a labor economy, which is most of the Western world has been over the last 20, 30 years, on a sort of, a real money basis, you're actually probably making less money than your parents. That's a very different scenario from basically the Asian generation. So I sometimes give the comment that the American dream is much more alive and well in Asia than it is in America, even though obviously that was the place we all wanted to go originally for that reason, right? So the point though is that it's because my friends, my neighbor, my next door guy, someone I see, they're making money from this, they're creating value, and I want to understand that better. That's how it's worked so far. And really think about it, the earliest narrative of this has been Bitcoin, right? And for those people who have known friends who have made value from Bitcoin, for instance, it intrigued them, and they go, "Oh, what's that? Let me learn about that," right? And then essentially you basically get sort of that social connection, and you get essentially people who start talking about it. In the Philippines with Axie Infinity, when people started making money playing games, it was small money because obviously the income is lower in Philippines. Then, in that sort of village neighborhood, people started talking, and then they all started doing it. And now you've got a place where in the Philippines, crypto is basically part of the nation's fabric in the sense, right? You can actually have a successful policy or sort of, village mayoral election without actually taking into account the whole sort of crypto narrative. And I would also argue that it's starting to begin in the US. I mean, if you take a look at the political narrative in the US, you have the Republican Party essentially embracing crypto. Whether they will succeed or not is a different question, but the point is it's now essentially in the political mainstream as a discussion. So I think it's only a matter of time. I think just in a few years where everyone starts doing it. Remember also that I think Web3 and crypto is generally the currency of the youth. They understand tokenization, maybe not as a system, but intrinsically the digital world is their world. People like me, we're digital immigrants, right? We came in from an analog world and we went into the digital world and we tried to understand it. They were born into this. They play games when they're young. They make their friends online. Yeah. So it makes sense for them to own their life online. It makes sense for them to own their data, their network effects, and through tokenization they can do that. So I actually think this is also generational. Just like how back in the days when people looked at social media, and people in my generation looked at MySpace and Friendster and then eventually Facebook and then said, "What's that? That's a fad." Well, and look today, right? So again, I think you just have to look at the youth to basically see what the future is like.
Right. But then how did you come to be able to foresee, because I mean, for those who don't know, you are probably the most prolific investor in the Web3, especially gaming space. I see you as one of those figures who are really trying to take this entire thing from a niche thing to the mainstream. And I think you've been doing a great job at that. You seem to have seen that from a very early age, or at least from the inception of Bitcoin. Is that something you've been dreaming about, or is it like, oh, that's gonna come? Or
so, there's also luck and circumstance that come into play. Our moment really came with CryptoKitties and NFTs in 2017. So we weren't really attracted to the space purely because of Bitcoin. The technology was interesting, of course, in terms of decentralization and digital property rights. But we couldn't really see how that at the time extended beyond essentially what appeared to be almost like a currency, almost like gold. I look at Bitcoin kind of like a digital gold, which is of course really important. But with CryptoKitties, we saw what you could do with digital identity and digital ownership of these rare assets that you have an experience online. And we never described NFTs as necessarily having to be valuable in terms of money terms, but valuable to yourself. The example I used to give to people is essentially like wedding rings. Wedding rings in and of itself may not be valuable from the material it's made of, but to the end user who owns that wedding ring, it's special to the people who own it. It also has magical properties almost that are priceless between the community that knows what that is. And that's why we look at certain art or painting or historical artifacts or relics in this type of way, because they speak to our story, to our identity, to who we are. When you look at things like, the Statue of Liberty, for instance, right? Or American artifacts or the Constitution, they themselves also represents really valuable aspects about something that makes it priceless, even though it's just basically a piece of paper and someone wrote some stuff on it, right?
Yeah.
The actual historical meaning behind it is actually much more valuable. And in gaming, we have this with, gaming skins and with basically virtual swords and items.
Yep.
When you ask our kids, what's the most valuable thing they'd like for Christmas? It's something virtual. It's not something physical. That's their construction of what's important to them, because that's where their social network is. That's where their value is. And we also always, I think, understood that value was virtual from a human perspective, meaning utility is often only a small percentage of why you do it. And essentially social and cultural and symbolic capital are actually the ones that are most important to us. Meaning, you don't buy a Birkin bag, for instance, because you can put stuff in it. And also you don't buy a Rolex watch to tell the time, right? If we only bought things for its pure utility, first of all, everything would be a lot cheaper. We'd all be wearing clothes that look exactly the same. And we'd all have one car that takes us from point A to point B, and that's it. But no, we have different clothes, we wear different shoes, we have cars in 100 different colors. Some look fast, some look big, some have leather inside. They all have different things that speak to us because we want to represent our culture, our identity, sort of our things that are valuable to us in different ways. It's also why we have tattoos, why we color our hair, right? And in gaming, we do this by having different skins. So for me, it was an understanding, having been early in the gaming world, that this is something that we always wanted, but we never could. And in fact, here in Korea, one of the largest, it was shut down, but one of the largest marketplaces existed for essentially trading what was back then illegal gaming goods. And they were illegal not because they were sort of black market in that way, but because the gaming companies who owned these digital assets and were renting them to the players didn't want that trade to happen. So they shut them all down, right? And that's actually something that was already a multi-billion-dollar industry. Or, World of Warcraft, when basically there were people playing in China making gold and selling them to, American players, on eBay in this very sort of, clumsy way. They basically, to us, it was natural that people wanted to have essentially some form of these digital items, and gaming was the natural way to get there. That's what got us into it. But I think the other thing for me is I'm a child of the 70s, so I've been around the block, and I basically grew up in Europe. And my mom used to work in Eastern Europe, basically in East Berlin. And so when I visited her, I saw another side of the world, which was essentially true communism, right? And that basically gave me an inkling as to what wasn't good. And I grew up in a socially democratic environment in Austria, which was basically, you can't even talk about money, right? I mean, and it's still like that in Europe as well, right? Yeah. And then I would go to America, which was then very pro-capitalist for the most part, and everyone just talked about money. And then I moved to Hong Kong to set up an internet service provider, and there it was basically capitalism overdrive, right? It was, probably Milton Friedman's wet dream, basically just sort of establishing itself. So I saw these cycles. I also saw the problems that capitalism in overdrive had as well. And that's why that history, my own experiences, building tech companies, making investments, looking at startups, and also being in the gaming world, I think that confluence of things gave me essentially that sort of inspiration as to why sort of digital ownership is so important, starting with gamers, but now broadly saying that actually everyone should have digital ownership.
I mean, it sounds to me like you really understood from an early age, maybe because of your background and your sort of cultural influence, you understood human nature. One of the conversations I was actually having I speak to, by the way, a lot of interesting people,
sure,
including maybe North Korean defectors, or even some North Korean spies.
Yes.
And they understand communism
Yes.
and how it really goes against human nature. And what blows my mind is that in Western culture right now, where like young college students all of a sudden all like Marxist,
Yes.
like looking,
Yes.
thinking that socialism or communism is like the way to solve this capitalist problem. I'm like,
So history,
really?
as the saying goes, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And I think what you see here is that, the problems. So when Marx first defined sort of the problems of capitalism, and remember, Marx, he advocated obviously for communism, but what is communism? It's really the abolishment of property rights overall. Essentially, his vision was entirely different. But he did say that in order for us to move to a communist society, we actually have to go through capitalism, and we have to be disillusioned effectively by capitalism as to where its effect were. Because remember, he was basically born at the time of the Industrial Revolution. We're talking about child labor. We're talking about people essentially working in coal mines and like destitute conditions. Right? That's what he saw, and he saw these problems. And the world isn't quite that way. But also his sort of, let's call it diagnosis, which is communism, wasn't the right solution. But I think a lot of people are enthralled by it because they say the things that he diagnosed about capitalism were true before and they're true now in terms of the problems when you have monopolistic practices take place as we see today. However, the solution is absolutely not that, because you only have to look at history to see where that got us. And that's the reason why in Asia, for instance, people talk about China and say, oh, but isn't China communist? Not at all, right? China is way more, basic capitalist than probably any European country in the world, the United Kingdom probably included, right? Yeah. So I think people over here understand that and appreciate that. But in the West, essentially, they look at that and I remember going to America where capitalism was, maybe even worshipped to the point where, hey, you made money, good for you, right? And I want to be there as well. I can succeed in that. But I think today it has sort of disappointed people. It made, most people couldn't participate in. For instance, just think about the cost of going to college, for instance, right? These things become unattainable to you. And so that essentially creates the problem where people feel disillusioned because they just don't feel they can get there. And I do think that's a problem that needs to be fixed, but I actually think Web3 can fix that. And the reason why I think Web3 can fix it is because the problem is that in the West, not enough people are actually capitalists. If most people were capitalists, they would be investors. They would own equity. They would own forms of property, but they don't. And that's because we don't teach it in school. Our children don't learn about money in, up until what, university? And then your first experience? Not even university, right? Unless you study economics or something. And then what's your first experience with money? Most of them is student debt. Yep. Right? So just think about that. Your first experience with money and financial systems is a form of indentured servitude, where you basically have to pay back a loan for, sometimes decades, right? No wonder people are saying, hey, you need to forgive this loan, this is not right, all that kind of stuff, because it feels unfair. And of course, with COVID, with QE, with essentially inflation, all these factors combined have essentially sort of made the rich richer and the poor much poorer. I think I read a stat that something like $40 to $45 trillion of new wealth was created essentially during and post-COVID.
They all went.
2/3 of that went to the 1 percentile, right? And so of course we have a problem. But in Web3, everyone can become a capitalist and capital owner, because when you own just a token, you're part of the network. So whether it's having owned Bitcoin years ago, whether it's owning Ethereum years ago, right? As these networks grow, you can benefit from their growth as you participate in these networks. That construct doesn't happen anymore in the West. If I want to benefit in an overall economy outside of a job, what do I buy? Can I buy a house in New York? Good luck, right? You can't even have a way of getting that kind of fractional ownership. That doesn't really happen as a way. You can have, for instance, just think about the constructs of companies. I think Apple, which is one of the biggest companies in the world, I think they have 80 to 85,000 shareholders, which is a big number. But think about how many hundreds of millions of people in the world use Apple products, right? Yep. None of them are shareholders. Almost every one of them basically is a user and essentially is a customer, right? But in Web3, you can imagine a future where 1 billion people are token holders, meaning 1 billion people can be owners of a network and derive value from the benefits of that network, right? That's basically what's now possible, which you couldn't do before. You can't administer, 1 billion shareholders in a company. That doesn't work. But you can administer millions of token holders or 1 billion token holders under one DAO or under one sort of ecosystem, right? And I also think the future is going to be essentially these decentralized community-owned organizations. Blockchain has shown the way in the sense that look at Bitcoin, look at Ethereum, look at Ton, look at Solana or Mocha or any one of these sort of token ecosystems. They're not actually owned or governed by a single entity. They're basically owned by the community, and they're basically driving them. And the combined market cap today, despite its small number of users relative to the world, in the Web3 world, basically is about $2.1 to $2.2 trillion. So, of course, lower than the market cap by, of Apple or Facebook, but roughly the market cap of companies like Amazon, right? And if you were to take Web3 as an industry, it would put it amongst the top 10 largest businesses in the world. So again, I think, we're early, but we're going to get there.
The wealth gap is just only growing as a result of, capitalism, which is, of course, it's going to give rise to income inequality. But at the same time, for those 90% of the people on the bottom, they have to work to make a bare living, and they're just desperate. They just want to make money. Can they survive in the Web3 world?
I think they can. And I think the reason why I say that is that, whatever job you do at the moment, you got to put some capital to work somewhere. And to me, essentially, Web3 seems to be the path of the future. We're also not, this is not financial advice, but certainly don't throw in your life savings or do crazy stuff, right? But my point is that we haven't taught enough people around how to invest, how to think about money. And, as a result, we essentially created this massive arbitrage of knowledge where the 1% who are capitalists, who know how to invest or can think about money, are basically taking most of the value because most of the world can't participate in them. And now you've got institutions and setups that actually even make it hard in some countries for people who don't have access to it to even enter those spaces, right? Yeah. I mean, one of the reasons why the Philippines was such a great breeding ground for this is because those people were unbanked.
Yeah.
They didn't even have a bank account. And they were making so little money that how could they even enter the financial world? Oh, a crypto wallet and essentially some tokens got you started, right? And I think that's how it begins. It is true that a large part of the world and growing are essentially being more disenfranchised, and they can't move up the ladder because they're just worried about the capital needs. And one of the things is also how do you get there? And I think this is where Web3 is also interesting because actually Web3 is a new wealth class. I think a lot of people, forget that the entire Web3 ecosystem is majority people who don't come from money, right? I mean, you don't have to just in America, take a look at what's happening in Miami, for instance. I mean, for a while, that place was not at all the epicenter of American growth, right? It was Silicon Valley, it was essentially what's happening in the Bay Area, in San Francisco, and Los Angeles, and Hollywood, and so on. But that narrative has now changed and moved, for instance, in America over to Miami, which is the fastest growing, essentially, I think, state, and then Florida, and then city as well. Yeah. And that area is embracing capitalism. There's growth in that area, and there's hope and there's opportunity. That capital does not come from the classic forms of capital. It isn't basically Wall Street bankers that said, hey, you know what, found crypto, let's enter that space. Nor is it basically people from Silicon Valley necessarily who are like, hey, you know what, I made some money in my startup, now I'm getting into crypto. There's a percentage of that, but the vast majority are people who come from used to be disenfranchised areas. People forget, for instance, the first NFTs that they bought, whether it be a Bored Ape or whether it's a Mochaverse or whether it's Land and Sandbox, were literally hundreds of dollars, or in some cases tens of dollars, or sometimes entirely free, right? And so even if you look at the prices and you say, oh, it's come down, we're still talking about $30,000 to $40,000 for one of these assets, right? That's life-changing money when you consider that some people bought them for just a couple $100s, right? Those are people who didn't come from wealth, right? And you see these cycles happening all the time. When I was younger, that was Silicon Valley, right? I mean, they were the ones disrupting Wall Street, coming in with their T-shirts and essentially their raw water and other things and yoga mats, basically, disrupting the world of suits and ties, essentially in New York. And now you have this new wave, basically, which is the people from Web3 who are coming in with their tattoos or whatever it is that they're coming, but actually disrupting, in some ways, the Silicon Valley elite, right? So in some ways, it's a classic tale of essentially class struggle as old as the story of humanity.